seeds of mistrust, what I was taught to believe. I grew up in a world where everything about Islam and Muslims was painted in fear. From the evening news to history class, from casual jokes to solemn warnings around dinner tables, the narrative was clear and consistent. Muslims were dangerous. They were either angry, oppressed, or radical. And Palestinians? The worst of the worst. They were portrayed as terrorists, fanatics, people who didn't value life, not their own, and certainly not others. It was a background noise of my childhood, so constant I stopped noticing it. News anchors use words like militant and extremist interchangeably with Muslim. Movies always show the Arab guy with a bomb. Even cartoons drew them with big noses, shouting in strange languages. I never thought to question it. Why would I? When every book, show, and speech echoed the same warning, it felt like common sense. I didn't hate Muslims, not consciously, but I feared them. I pitied them. And most of all, I avoided them. My heart would race if someone wearing a hijab walked into the room. I'd scan their face, wondering what they really thought about the West. I assumed they were angry at me, even if they smiled. Over time, this fear turned into judgment. I'd see protests in Palestine and immediately think, why are they always angry? Why can't they just make peace? I had strong opinions about the conflict, but couldn't have found Gaza on a map. I could recite stats about suicide bombings, but knew nothing about occupation. I pointed to images of rockets and rubble, but never once asked, who started this? Who's suffering the most? Why are they still fighting after all these years? Then came university, a place that prides itself on diversity, a melting pot of faces, beliefs, questions, and identities. For the first time in my life, I was truly surrounded by people who didn't look like me, think like me, or worship like me. And for the first time, I had to sit with my discomfort. That's where I met Omar. We were randomly assigned as roommates. When I saw his name, I'll admit, my stomach dropped. Omar Ahmed. It said on the door. The first few days, I was on edge. I noticed everything. How he rolled out a prayer mat in the mornings. How he washed his hands and feet before prayer. How he spoke Arabic softly on the phone with his parents. I didn't understand, and so I assumed the worst. I waited for the moment he'd say something radical. I thought I'd catch a glimpse of the danger I'd been warned about my entire life. But instead, I saw something else. I saw kindness, humor, intelligence, patience. He didn't fit the mold. He was obsessed with soccer. He made cheesy dad jokes. He offered me dates during Ramadan and invited me to his community potlucks. He never once preached, never tried to convert me. He just lived his life. One night, after a long conversation about global politics, which we often had while eating instant noodles at 1 a.m., Omar asked me gently, "Have you ever spoken to a Palestinian?" I blinked. "No," I said honestly. "Do you want to meet one?" There was a pause. 1,000 thoughts ran through my head. But for some reason, I said yes. That yes changed everything. Meeting the other side, my first Palestinian friend. Her name was Layla, a small, quiet woman with deep brown eyes that seemed to carry the weight of both wisdom and sorrow, and the kind of calm strength that made you listen when she spoke. She wore a kefiyu, the traditional scarf that draped over her shoulders like a symbol of her heritage and struggle. Her voice was gentle yet unwavering, and every word she spoke carried the grace of someone who had endured more than most could ever imagine. Layla carried a sadness that was impossible to miss, the kind of grief that comes from seeing loved ones torn apart by violence and loss. Yet despite it all, she had an air of quiet dignity that commanded respect. We met at a campus panel on conflict resolution, a subject I had always been passively interested in but never truly invested in. I sat at the back of the auditorium, expecting to hear the usual political rhetoric about the Middle East. You know, the same kind of statements that reinforce stereotypes about the region and its people. But what Layla shared that day completely upended my perspective. She spoke of growing up in Gaza, a place I had only ever heard about in the context of warfare and strife. She told us of nights filled with the incessant hum of drones overhead instead of the lullabies that should comfort a child. Her childhood memories weren't of carefree summers, but of hiding beneath makeshift shelters and hearing the wail of sirens that had long become the soundtrack of her life. She spoke of friends, young and old, whose lives were cut short too soon, not by disease or accident, but by the violence that had become an inseparable part of her reality. She told us how, as a child, she would learn the names of herbs from her grandmother, the very same grandmother who had taught her how to tend to the wounded and how to calm a frightened heart. But what struck me the most, what left me in stunned silence, was how she spoke of hope amidst such despair. "I don't hate Israelis," she said, her voice steady, though tinged with pain. "I hate injustice. I hate watching my people die for wanting freedom. I hate that my family is constantly torn apart by wars that shouldn't exist." Her voice trembled briefly, and for a moment I saw the burden of her story in her eyes. But what hit me even harder was that despite the weight of everything she had endured, her eyes never wavered. They remained strong, determined, and full of an unspoken promise that no matter how many walls and barriers were built around her, her resolve would never break. After the panel, I walked up to her, my heart heavy with the weight of her words. I had so many questions about Gaza, about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, about Islam, about everything I had been led to believe was true. But the only thing I managed to say, stammering slightly, was, "I didn't know." I felt embarrassed, almost ashamed, for all the years I had spent misunderstanding, misjudging, and holding on to stereotypes without ever asking questions. Layla smiled gently, the kind of smile that wasn't pitying or condescending, but full of understanding. "That's okay," she said, her voice soft and reassuring. "Now you do." Over the next few weeks, Layla and I began talking more. I asked her about Islam, about prayer, about the Quran, things I had always heard about but never truly understood. She was patient with me, answering every question, no matter how naive it might have seemed. To my surprise, I found that what she shared was nothing like the image I had been fed my entire life. The Quran, I learned, wasn't filled with calls for violence or revenge, as I had been led to believe. Instead, it was filled with messages of peace, mercy, justice, and compassion. There were verses that spoke of protecting the weak, of feeding the poor, of striving for fairness in a world often riddled with injustice. I remember one particular conversation where she explained the concept of zakat, the Islamic practice of charity. She described it as an obligation, not just a voluntary act of kindness, but a duty to share what you have with those in need. I was struck by how much emphasis there was on the collective responsibility of society to ensure no one was left behind. It was nothing like the picture painted for me all my life. One evening, Layla invited me to a Friday prayer at her mosque. I hesitated at first. The idea of stepping into a mosque, as someone who had grown up with so many misconceptions about Islam, was intimidating. But she said, "Just come and watch. You don't have to participate. Just be there with us." So I went. What I saw that day still stays with me. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fire or fury. It was peace. A room full of people standing shoulder to shoulder, different races, different ages, different walks of life, all united in silent communion with their Creator. I had always imagined that prayer in a mosque would be loud, filled with fervent calls for war or retribution. But instead, it was quiet, serene, even, with a soft murmur of prayers echoing in unison, as if each person was reaching out for solace, for mercy, for connection. The women, too, were there, some wearing the hijab, others without, all praying, all equally valued in that space. The imam's voice, warm and gentle, guided us through the prayers, and there was a sense of reverence that I hadn't expected. The entire experience was peaceful, not violent. It was something that made me feel safe. For the first time, I felt the weight of the world's misconceptions fall away. Something stirred within me that day, a realization that the path I had been following, shaped by fear and misunderstanding, was leading me away from truth. But what I had witnessed in that mosque, through Layla's eyes, was a glimpse of something different, something better. It wasn't just a religion, it was a way of life that honored peace, understanding, and justice. A way of life I needed to understand more deeply. Gaza through their eyes, what the media didn't show. Fueled by curiosity, I dove deeper. I began reading Palestinian authors, watching documentaries, and following journalists on the ground. The more I immersed myself in their stories, the more I realized how blind I had been. The overwhelming reality that I had only seen through the lens of mainstream media began to unravel. The stories coming out of Gaza weren't just about bombings. They were about resilience. People finding ways to create beauty in the midst of unimaginable chaos. I saw children playing soccer in the alleyways between crumbling buildings, their laughter echoing despite the devastation. Artists were painting murals on broken walls, transforming the rubble into expressions of hope and defiance. Teachers were holding classes in rooms with no electricity, using the dim light of candles to teach a generation that refused to be silenced. The images I had once seen of destruction were only part of the picture. I began to understand that this wasn't just a conflict between two groups, but an ongoing tragedy that had robbed thousands of people of their basic human rights. What I had missed were the stories of survival, the resilience of people who, despite everything, still found ways to hold on to their dignity, their dreams, and their faith. I saw hospitals running out of supplies, not due to negligence or mismanagement, but because of blockades that strangled every avenue of relief. The healthcare system was under siege, and it wasn't by choice. It was a result of restrictions imposed on Gaza. I saw families mourning, not just the loss of loved ones, but the loss of futures. But even in the face of this, life still went on in the most remarkable ways. Weddings were held in the rubble of bombed-out buildings, as couples chose to celebrate their love despite everything, creating moments of joy in a place defined by grief. And despite the horror of it all, mourning mothers still held on to their faith. They wept, yes, but they also prayed, finding solace in their belief in a higher power. And then I saw faith in ways I never understood before. Despite everything, Palestinians held on to their belief in Allah, not with bitterness, but with profound sense of trust. They said, Alhamdulillah, praise be to God, even in the face of overwhelming loss. This wasn't the faith I had been taught to fear or misunderstand. This wasn't the anger-driven faith I'd seen on the news. It was a faith rooted in patience, resilience, and unwavering hope. I remember one video that particularly struck me, a clip of a little boy, no older than 10, standing amidst the wreckage of what was once his home. His younger sister clung to him as he held her tightly. The camera focused on his face, marked by the sorrow of someone who had already witnessed too much loss for his age. He looked directly into the lens and said, "They can take everything, but they can't take our God." That moment shattered the walls I had built around myself. The strength, the clarity, and the certainty in his voice made me realize something fundamental. Faith wasn't something you had when life was easy, when things went according to plan. It was something you clung to when life became unbearable. It was the one thing no one could take away, no matter how much destruction they wrought. At that moment, my perspective shifted. I had always thought of faith as something that cushioned you when times were good, something that offered comfort when life was easy. But what I saw in Gaza made me realize that faith is often born out of the hardest trials. The Palestinian people chose to hold on to their beliefs despite the suffering they endured, and that was not only a testament to their resilience but to the power of their faith. It was then that I began to see Islam not as a religion of violence or extremism, but as a source of survival. It wasn't just a set of rituals or doctrines. It was a way of life that provided strength and meaning even in the darkest moments. The people I had once feared and misunderstood were, in fact, living examples of the core values that Islam taught: patience, resilience, and an unwavering trust in the mercy of God. I began to understand that Islam, at its heart, is about peace. The peace that comes from within, the peace that anchors you when everything around you is crumbling. The faith that Palestinians held on to in the face of endless adversity was not a weapon for hatred, but a lifeline. And it was this realization that started to unravel the misconceptions I had carried for so long. What I had been taught was not the truth. It was a narrative designed to divide, to fear, and to conquer. But in the stories of Gaza, I found a different truth, one that was far more powerful. A truth of hope, faith, and survival against all odds. And from that point on, I began to see the world differently.